Hi, I'm Melissa Platt, Executive Director for Mental Health Association of San Mateo County, an agency that has been serving the San Mateo County community for over 60 years. I'm extremely pleased to introduce our host and our speaker for today for the second of our three-part series on schizophrenia. Angie Coiro is an award-winning radio journalist and interviewer who is also the host of the syndicated radio show In Deep with Angie Coiro. We are delighted that she is hosting all 3 episodes of MHA's Storytellers series. Today, Angie will be in conversation with Randye Kaye, voiceover artist, radio host, actress, singer, award-winning author, and parent of a child with schizophrenia. Please welcome Angie Coiro and Randye Kaye.
Thank you so much. And it's good to have everyone here visiting us today to check this conversation out. It's going to be a very good conversation. We're basing it in part on the book, which has been Behind His Voices. And that came out in 2011. But since then, Randye has been doing so much advocacy and so much hard work in the area of mental health and helping other people with mental health issues, especially within the family, that we're going to go back and forth between both of those. And I want to let you know that throughout our conversation, you can put your questions in the chat box and I'll weave those in as we go along. So we have plenty of time together. Don't be shy about putting your questions there. Randye, welcome. It's so good to be with you.
Thank you, Angie. Nice to be here.
So in a sense, I'm starting at the end of the book because your last chapter says, never give up hope. And the book shows your hope kind of rising and flagging over the years. And I want you, as a preface, to kind of put yourself in the position of someone listening to this conversation. Back in the worst of the years that you experienced, what could someone have told you that would have let you know that things were not hopeless?
I think what I would have liked to have heard is his life may never be the life that you planned when you gave birth to him, or the life that, or necessarily the life you think he deserves, but there is a chance for your son to have a life, for his life to matter, for him to do work that matters, for him to be able to give and receive love and be part of the family, and that you will all learn that that has to be enough. And still, with hope and research and new science, maybe even better than that.
We're going to talk about a lot of the developing science. And for people who haven't picked up yet, been Behind His Voices, there's it functions on 2 levels. You're telling his story, which of course is your own story, but you also put in a lot of guidelines and grids about how the law works, what's happening with medicine, what we know and don't know about schizophrenia. So let's plumb both of those. One that I think I do want to recognize along the same line that we just talked about is that your story with Ben is not a happily ever after. We shouldn't prepare ourselves for that. In fact, I saw on your blog that he was hospitalized as recently as February. So first I want to ask how you're doing. How are you doing with all this?
Oh, thank you. You know, it is what it is. I mention that often in the book. Do I wish my son did not have schizophrenia? You bet. Do I wish I could have prevented it? I could magically make it go away. We all would like to have a magic wand. I don't have that. And so I have learned through this trauma and others that it is what it is, and you make the most of it and you do the best you can. And so, you know what? I'm doing fine. I'm doing as fine as can be expected. Every time there's a new crisis, and there's always a new crisis when someone you love has an illness, and particularly a mental illness, I have a lot of mantras that I say to myself. They're just sort of the power of words. And I just say, whatever happens, we'll handle it somehow, or it is what it is, or tomorrow might be better, or do what you can and let the rest go. I mean, there's so many things that help. So we're doing okay. And yes, I have to say that COVID was a blow for many of us, and it was for our family as well.
Mm-hmm. Are you able to see him regularly?
Well, I think let me backtrack just a bit. The short answer to that is I can see him at his group home now in the parking lot with masks on. But he just got his first vaccination, and we're hopeful, as everybody is.
Yeah.
You know, I've had my 2 doses. He had his first, he'll have a second one at the end of April, and I'm able to see him. But he was hospitalized at the end of August. And after rather valiantly trying to barrel through COVID and the loss of his job,
Mhm.
which is all since happened since the book came out almost 10 years ago. And he was in the hospital 5.5 months. I could not see him for that entire time. There was no visitation. There were a couple of Zoom calls, but
Mm.
that was it. So
Yeah, that's hard.
no one can see him, and he has his cell phone back, and he's very good at texting. He's very funny when he texts. So we have that back. So you take what you can get.
Yeah, understood. Let's go into his life a little bit. And
Okay.
this seems to be something I hear a lot with people who develop schizophrenia later on. I so often hear stories that they were smart and loving and bright. In Ben's case, he just jumped on his role as big brother. He basically adopted his sister as soon as he met her. Is that really as common as it seems, that it starts out that well?
Everybody has a different path. I would say that the most common path for males with schizophrenia is to develop it, beginning symptoms, gradual onset in mid-teens. And it
Mhm.
comes on gradually. It's like the frog, and you put them in cold water and you gradually warm up the water, and they don't realize they're in boiling water. That's kind of how it happens. Every parent of a teenager will tell you that teenage years are hard. I
Mhm.
know you have a cat and I have a cat, and the most apt description I ever heard was they turn from puppies into cats. Like, instead of, oh, mommy's home, it's like, oh, she's home. Feed me. I don't really need you. So we all learn when our kids become teenagers to kind of roll with the punches and adjust our parenting. And at first I didn't know that anything my sweet boy was doing, the changes that were happening, there was no way to differentiate that from slightly squared teenage angst.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and so it is very common, to answer your question, that for the male pattern of schizophrenia, the most common is bright, wonderful child, often very sweet, often very loving, doesn't develop any symptoms until about 15 or 16, which
Mhm.
seem manageable at first and get gradually worse until there's psychosis that's evident. And then at that point, it can be eligible for a diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Mhm.
And it's heartbreaking. But there's a lot that happens. And that's why the subtitle of the book is One Family's Journey from the Chaos of Schizophrenia to Hope. Because that beginning is chaos, those years of what the heck is happening? I know he needs a therapist. I know, oh, he's using marijuana. No wonder. Oh, he has a girlfriend now. Everybody changes when they have a girlfriend. You don't notice, you can't see at first what it is. It's
Mhm.
less common with females to have it happen that soon. Although it depends. I mean, there are some people are born with it too, but with females, it generally happens later when they are off to college, and sometimes it can happen suddenly. It can begin with psychosis. So it is a common pattern to have this wonderful, incredibly bright child, and then to lose many parts of that child when the brain illness takes over.
Mhm.
It's heartbreaking.
Is there a point as a member of the family or as a friend, it's natural to fall into what caused this? Why are they schizophrenic? And you talk about the earlier days of science when it was bad parenting, was a bad
Right.
mother. Uh, and we're well beyond that. But my question to you is, how much value does it have to a family member to try to figure out the why? Is there an important function to that, or are you trying to move past it?
I went past why a long time ago. It's the question I most commonly get. And I believe it's from people who want to make sure it's not going to happen to their kid,
Mhm.
or to find if there are ways. It helps a little bit to know why, but I can't prevent it anymore. I can't fix it. I looked, believe me, for genetic roots of it. And I think if you know a little bit about the why, and you know that schizophrenia runs in your family, you'll be more alert to the signals and more alert to the signs. And there is much research that shows that the earlier you catch psychosis, or if you can treat the illness before the first psychotic episode or soon after that first episode, the chances for recovery, and I use that word recovery as a process, not as an event, the same way they do in the alcoholism movement. The chances for recovery of life are better the earlier you treat it. So I guess knowing the why would be helpful if you know to be aware to look for signs earlier. But the research I've learned about say that it may be genetic, but not necessarily inherited. So that there may be a DNA switch that happens that they maybe inherited the tendency for, but it may or may not happen. So the why can help in terms of knowing what to look for as a family member. But at this point, and my son is 38 now, looking for why doesn't really help me. It just is. He got the bad luck to have a brain illness that changed his brain, and we would love to cure it. And in the meantime, we are trying to manage it.
I want to go back to some of that science. There's a lot in what you just said. And one of the things is that if you can catch it that much earlier, this is something I didn't know, is that all of those, there's evidence that each episode of psychosis makes it a little harder for the brain to recover.
Yes, that I learned a lot about schizophrenia. Once I understood that my son had this illness, and it took a few years because it's not in the baby books, I started educating myself as much as possible. I read Surviving Schizophrenia. I read many books, and many of them were not hopeful, which is one of the reasons I wrote mine. But I also took a course, as I'm sure you know, because you read my book, called Family to Family, which NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, offers as a free course taught by family members in a very prescribed fashion. So we're giving accurate information, and help me learn about my son's illness. And every year they update it with the latest research. And when I came to the class of understanding schizophrenia and the latest research, and it said every psychotic episode, there is evidence of gray matter in your brain being destroyed, that just about broke my heart. I'll say it broke my heart many times in the next hour, I think, because it became clear to me that it was an illness, but that every time and he now, stops taking his meds and he gets psychotic again, that could make his brain even worse and make it even harder to get back on the medication. So that preventing psychosis is huge in future recovery.
Well, in terms of managing expectations, you describe, and we're going to go through more of his story, but there's one point where he seems to hit a high pitch of how responsive he is. You were at a ceremony that recognized his progress. He was beaming. He was proud. He knew you were proud of him. And since then, he has gone a little downhill from there. You think that perhaps he may never see that level of wellness again, or is it still possible?
It is still possible. There's a lot that goes into success for anybody with or without an illness. And I always talk about, since the book came out, I've flown all over the world speaking to people, not lately, of course, but I'm Zooming a lot. And I'm not an expert. I am just a mom. I call myself an MRQ, a mom who refused to quit. That's part of the movement that I'm in. And although I recognize there's only so much I can do, it's letting go and stepping in and knowing what that balance is, the serenity prayer. And I lost the train of the question.
I was talking about whether whether you could expect him to peak again at such a
Thank you.
high level.
Okay, so I talk about the 4 pillars of recovery. Again, recovery as a process, and one is treatment. Now, there's a lot of controversy, and I don't know if any of the participants now have schizophrenia, whether you're on medication or not. It's a very personal thing. Schizophrenia is a cluster of symptoms, and it's not necessarily the same for one person as for the other. All I can talk about is my son's experience, and for him, treatment must include medication, because without his medication, within 48 hours, he is psychotic and gesticulating and not talking to anybody but something internal, which he does not admit to, but looks to me like voices. And within 48 hours of stopping medication, every single time without fail, he's been back in the hospital. So that clearly his medication is as important to his success as insulin is for a type 1 diabetic. So treatment is one pillar, but it's not the only thing. We're all human beings. And so structure helps. I think we're all comforted by structure.
Yes.
And sometimes in the hospital, it's just knowing 10 o'clock is group and 12 o'clock is lunch. We're all comforted by structure, some more than others. So treatment, structure, purpose. One of the saddest things about schizophrenia is that it can rob you of your ability to contribute to the world. Are you employable? Will somebody ever take your advice on something? So purpose is huge. And the fourth thing is love. And that can be love as deep as a mother's love for her son or a sister's love for her brother or any family love, but it can also be community. Think of all the communities most of us have. Work communities, school communities, neighborhoods. Schizophrenia can rob you of that as well. So what at the moment in the book when he was so proud, he had just been in treatment for a year. And there is brain damage, and I believe in neuroplasticity, and I think his brain was starting to rewire a little bit because of consistent treatment and the other 3 factors. And he was in something called a clubhouse, which is it's from the International Clubhouse Federation, and it was a place where he could go, and he does not believe he has schizophrenia. He has never admitted to it, but he did go, and they made him the editor of the paper, and he just got into it, and
Right.
he felt purpose again, and that was that moment when he was so proud. So going back to now, at the end of the book, I say, my son may never work, and he may never get a paycheck, and what I have to do as a mother is reduce my expectations. In fact, why should I judge anybody on whether or not they can earn a paycheck? That's not my place to judge. As a mother, you always hope your kids will be self-sufficient and support you one day, haha. But, my son may never, but that doesn't mean he can't have purpose. Maybe he can do volunteer work. Maybe he has a purpose as a brother. He'll have a purpose as an uncle someday. So I leave the book on that note. And then I will say in the last 10 years, after the book came out, Ben had he got a job, and it changed him. His success level, he felt like a person again. He felt useful. He loved it. He showed up on time. He embraced it. And then he was kicked out of his group home because he was doing too well and put into an apartment with a lease that he was supposed to pay for himself without proper support, and he fell apart. And he went back in the hospital for nearly 2 months. I outlined this in my blog. If anybody has read the book and they want to know what happened, go to benbeyondhisvoices.com, and the blog will spell it all out. But all that success fell apart. The place where he was employed was wonderful enough to say to me, well, if he's in the hospital, he's in the hospital. I don't care what unit he's on. Tell him his job's waiting for him when he gets out, even though they knew he had schizophrenia. And then when he got out, he worked at that job And then he moved in with us because I didn't trust the system anymore. And in the last 9 years, he worked his way through constant treatment, structure, support, and love to getting off Social Security, working at his dream job as a restaurant server. That's what he's always wanted to do. Worked his way up to full-time employment and training the new servers. And full disclosure, there were some restaurants that didn't quite embrace his quirky personality, but this particular restaurant did. And when it was a good fit, he was working there happily full-time. He leased a Lexus, not the best decision, but he paid the bills. He had some friends and he was doing really well. So yes, he did reach that level of success again.
Mhm.
He never has reached the point where he has insight into his illness. And he always wants to credit himself and not medication and not treatment for doing well. His dream is to do as well as he was doing and get off meds. And that is and was a constant awareness between us. I gave up a long I gave up a long time ago trying to convince him he has schizophrenia. There's something called anosognosia, which I explain in the book. Part of the illness is not being aware you have it. And
Yes.
he may never get that awareness. And that's the hard part, because I can't legally force him to take medication, but as this is my house, if you want to live here, this is what you do. We pulled that card and it worked for 9 years. Unfortunately, COVID came. Restaurant servers didn't do well. He lost his job. And with that, he lost a lot and began more actively cheating on taking his meds, and gradually had another breakdown in August and spent 5.5 months in the hospital. So can he get back to where he was? I hope so, because there were nights when we would go and he would wait on our table and I could see what an amazing waiter he was. He also earned 60 college credits. So there is hope. The problem is that right now the treatments are so unsophisticated that you have to continue taking the meds. And right now the medication he's on is not the one he was on before. And it
Mhm.
doesn't work as well in my eyes, but it's his decision because I can't fix it. So yes, there is hope. Success is possible with steady treatment and those other 3 things.
It's interesting. In your answer, we can hear so many balancing acts.
Oh,
What can I get him to do? What can I not get him to do? How far can he go? How far can he not go?
right.
How do you cope? One of the questions I have is about his own inability to see what's going on with him.
Mhm.
Just the thought process behind that. What does he tell himself about why he has to take meds? Does he recognize there's a condition, if not schizophrenia?
So it's a very good question. Anosognosia is a diagnosed symptom, very much publicized by Dr. Xavier Amador, who wrote a book called I Am Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. And Dr. Amador had a brother with schizophrenia and also is a doctor. And he noticed that people with strokes often don't know they've had a stroke. If the stroke affects the part of your brain where the logic resides, mostly the frontal cortex, and many people with strokes, and you say, raise your right arm, and they don't, and they'll say, I did.
Mm.
So a symptom of the stroke, which affects the brain, is that you're not aware you have the illness. It's a real thing. And many people with schizophrenia, I learned not to call it denial or stubbornness. I learned to call it lack of insight. It's not his fault that his brain won't allow him to see the logic of it. Now, add to that the fact that he's a Taurus, he's stubborn, and many of us don't want to think we're ill or name it because, stigma is part of it, but not as big a part of it as a lot of people say. I think that it's more a sense of pride. He has said to me, I don't want the medication to take credit for what I do. I don't need the medication. How many of us stop taking antibiotics halfway through the course because we think we know better than the doctor?
Feel better. Yeah, I'm
Right?
better now.
Yeah, I'm better now. And I'll save more for the next time I get sick. And we don't want the medication to have the control. So there's that feeling of, I want credit for doing this without help. And emotionally, he's still a little bit adolescent because that's where his brain kind of changed and froze. So emotionally, he's got that adolescent, I can do it myself kind of thing, which we all have. It's things we all have, but exaggerated by the illness. On top of it, medications have side effects. And
Yeah.
that's what he tells me he doesn't like. He doesn't like how it makes him feel tired. He doesn't like the weight gain. He doesn't like how it makes him, he was on something called Clozaril. I'm not here to prescribe any medication. That happened to be the medication he was on at the end of the book. And and he succeeded so well on, currently not on that medication, unfortunately. It made him drool onto the pillow. So I have taught family to family, and what I always say to groups, and for any of you who are listening here, and maybe you have schizophrenia and you don't know what your family thinks, I do want to hear what you have to say because my son won't talk about it. But for family members, they don't understand. And so what I've said to family members, and this comes straight from NAMI, is how many of you, if I told you you had an illness that you didn't think you have, and I told you that everything you believe is not true. You have this illness. I know you don't think you have it, but trust me, you have it. So here's a medication. It's going to make you gain 30 or 40 pounds, and you won't like sex too much anymore, or your performance won't be there. And it's going to make you drowsy, but trust me, you need it. How many would take it? And I think that's what it feels like to my son. He sees it as, he doesn't want the med to take credit, and he doesn't want the side effects of the med. And then there's voices that I perceive as voices that telling him not to take it. So there's all those things.
Mhm.
They're real to him.
You're touching on a lot that we have in our Q&A box. So let's
All
go to
right.
some of those.
Okay.
We hear first from, let me get down to this one. We hear from someone who was diagnosed with schizoid affective disorder at 8, wasn't diagnosed until he was 18. He was showing the symptoms at 8. I'd like to know if I could ever live a life without medication, and can I ever recover from this? How does one assess whether that's even possible?
I'm not a doctor. I'm only a
Understood.
mom. And I hope that you have support from somewhere, hopefully from your family. If not, it sounds great that you have insight into your illness. I hope so. It's hopeful and angering to know that research for treatment for schizophrenia is where treatment for cancer was like decades ago.
Mm.
It's not good enough yet. No one has come up with a medication that won't cause weight gain, and no one has come up with a cure. They're working on it. They're working on it, but not hard enough and not funded enough. And so is there hope? I think there is, if enough attention is paid to really curing this illness. But in the meantime, I hope that you will stay on your medication and stay in a place where you can contribute to the world,
Mhm.
because you have a lot to give. Just the fact that you have this awareness, and the longer you stay on the treatment, I believe the more your brain will get used to new pathways where you can do the best you can. Maybe you can work part-time, maybe you can work full-time, maybe you can do volunteer work, maybe you can be a peer counselor. My son didn't jump to full-time employment. It took him 9 years, and it started with 6 college credits a semester, and that was all he could handle. But the longer he succeeded, the better he succeeded.
I do want to take a little tangent when you were talking about them not working fast enough to find a cure for this. And I know that pharma companies are often motivated by how widespread an illness is, because of course that's going to get them the research money back if they can
Right.
deal with a widespread illness.
Right.
Schizophrenia is probably more widespread than a lot of people realize. It's not
Mhm.
some rarity. So I'm kind of wondering what the lack of initiative is there.
That's where stigma may come in. I mean, 1% of the population has schizophrenia. And I know there's been an uptick in diagnosis of cases of autism and other things. And and a lot of people going, oh, social media, smartphone use, too much television, whatever. Schizophrenia has been 1% of the population like forever. And no matter what country we talk about. So there's not been an uptick. But what there has been is a reduction in treatment facilities without anything to take its place. And so people don't know what to do. This is where stigma may come in terms of research dollars. It floors me that there is so much empathy for an old person with Alzheimer's and so much empathy for a child with cancer, as there should be.
Of course.
Why is there so little empathy for my son whose life was stolen from him when he was 15 years old and has fought valiantly to have a normal life for the last 20 years with an illness that he doesn't believe he has? And yet he is trying his hardest. Why is there no empathy for him? Why is there no research into the loss of life that starts in your teens instead of after you've had a chance to live your life and have children? And I know, look, if I had a parent with Alzheimer's, I'd be heartbroken too. I'm not taking that away.
Of course.
But where is the empathy for people with a thought disorder who need treatment and yet don't know they need treatment?
Mhm.
So I think if people with schizophrenia could advocate could say, hey, I've got this illness and it sucks. Come on, let's get together. Let's, it doesn't happen with mental illness because people don't want to admit they have it, or they aren't aware they have it, and they can't advocate for themselves. So, or maybe they can, but those who don't know they have it can't. And it's the moms and the sisters and the kids of people with schizophrenia who are going, hey, help that person.
Mhm.
But there isn't the empathy that I wish there were that would spark more caring and more dollars into funding schizophrenia research and cure.
Mhm. Deborah has asked us a question that you've answered part of, but I think it's important to go into her whole question. She says that she has a son who is 38, diagnosed at 18. He had issues before that. He used to be top of his class, top cross, and there's that story again, the top cross country runner. She's taking depression meds to cope. And after the first 8 horrible years, she said he started to take meds. He's still having bad delusions every day. He can't work, has difficult being around anyone. He knows he won't get married. And this adds to his depression. He has panic attacks, still has obsessive compulsive behaviors, has no feeling. And she remarks late in the comment that he's got no purpose. He won't volunteer. He feels he has no purpose. So what do you do with that?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew. It sounds like a different medication might work better, but families are all facing that. We can't get a psychiatrist. We can't get an appointment. We can't get somebody willing to help us make a change. We face what all parents face, which is my kid thinks he's a grown-up and I can't fix his life. And yet if my son asks me for help, I'm right there. But I've learned not to volunteer help. And that's just a parental thing, period.
Mhm.
There are 2 sets of symptoms with schizophrenia. One is positive symptoms. And by positive, it doesn't mean good. It means added to your personality. And those are the things that get you the diagnosis: hallucinations, delusions, thoughts of grandeur, things like that are added to your personality. Just as devastating are the negative symptoms. Negative meaning taken away from your personality. And it sounds like that's what your son is having. Loss of ambition, the inability to feel joy, the inability to feel deep emotions, the inability to make sense of their life because the logic centers are affected. So it's hard to make decisions. It's, there's so much. I always say that when my son was doing so well, he was back 65%.
Mm.
And, I'll take it every once in a while. I look at who he was as a little boy when there was joy behind his eyes, and I just want my son back.
Mhm.
I just want my son back. I'm sure you feel the same way. It's heartbreaking for us. It's more heartbreaking for them. And part of the problem with getting sane, and I'm going to use air quotes, getting sane and going into treatment and, calming down the delusions enough is that you start to go, oh my God, my life sucks. I remember my son when he was, this scene is in the book, when he was 21 and just finally getting stable on medication. And his little sister was about to go off to college. And my son had dropped out of high school, had gone to a troubled teen program. And while there, actually before he went there, but he managed to get a GED and earn a few college credits. So he could have caught up, kind
Mhm.
of like he wasn't going to go away to Yale or anything like we thought when he was 8, but he could still have caught up. And that started with community college. And, plans change all the time. Parenting is the most humbling thing ever. You think you're going to have a ballet dancer and she's 6 feet tall. So, our expectations are one thing, but their expectations for themselves are something else. And, Ben was getting, he was coherent. He was doing really well, and we could have conversations. And Allie, my daughter, was showing him the maps for campus and the pamphlets. And this is how I knew he was back. He was like, so, oh, Allie, that's so cool. I'm so happy for you. And he waited until she left to go to the ladies' room before he looked at me and said, Mom, how come my little sister gets to go to college before I do? And it was at that moment that I realized his hopes and dreams were shattered. And he doesn't really know why. He
Mm.
doesn't understand it. And he'll never get to go to college. He'll probably never get married. Not saying you can't get married if you have schizophrenia. I do know people who have it, who are aware of it and find a way to a relationship. But his friends that he went to school with, or even those that like experimented with drugs when they were teenagers, they're doctors and lawyers and construction workers or anything. They have a life, and it can kind of steal your life away. And so part of the problem with getting stable on medication is suddenly you go, oh my God, what have I done with my life?
Mm.
Whereas when you're psychotic, the voices tell you you're awesome, or you know everything, or you're Jesus, or you're going to write a poem that's going to change the world. It can be very comforting to return to the problem of delusions.
Right.
You don't have to face what you've done with your life. So.
One thing's happening in our conversation that I think probably happens amongst families who have a member who's schizophrenic. We haven't talked much about your daughter. And I think that that's almost reflective of this inevitable situation where the person with the problem gets all the attention.
Mhm.
And I want to talk about how Allie coped with that, how you helped her cope with that, because she couldn't be the center of attention. She didn't have that level of problems.
Thank you for bringing that up, because siblings are very underrepresented, and I'm an aware mother, and I obviously did everything I could to treat my son, but because I only have two, and I was single parenting, if you haven't read the book, the father of my children deserted the family when my kids were like 3 and 5.5, and we didn't see him for 12 years. It was a whole big mystery, an open gaping wound, because we didn't know where he went. So that's another situation. But the reason I tell you that is that I raised them myself, and they were the focus of my world. Obviously, I had no child support and I had to work a lot, and it is what it is. Every family's got what they've got. My children had such a great relationship with each other. All of Allie's friends were like, your brother is the best. He's so nice. And believe me, they had their moments. I'm not saying he was perfect, but overall, as big brothers go, he was kind, he was sweet, he liked to help her. He was like everybody, the phone was ringing off the hook for him to babysit. That's how amazing he was. And Allie really looked up to him. And when he started to act really weird, she didn't quite know what to do with that information. And I did my best to do the balancing act of just letting Ben's consequences happen as a result of his behavior. You didn't do your homework, you got an F. That's what happens. And not take my focus off of her.
Mhm.
I was aware that this could happen because I know a lot of therapists. And so I don't feel like I ignored her. And when she was entering high school, Ben had dropped out of school and was really being a pain in the butt. Not gonna lie. I mean, he wouldn't take a shower. His hair was all matted. He thought work was a government plot. Like now I look back and I go, oh my God, he was psychotic, but I just thought he was on drugs.
Right.
And I made the decision to send him away partly so that I could just be with Allie, so that we could have the house to ourselves, that her crazy brother wasn't going to be around. And he was gone for about a year. And I remember being on a plane to go visit him, torn between two children. But I'm very glad that I did not ignore my daughter.
Mhm.
But I also know I can't fix her broken heart for having lost her big brother. She says to me now, you know, I lost a big brother, but I gained a little brother. That's how it feels. And when he's functional, you know, he's adorable. He's,
Yeah.
you know, he's quirky and flighty and he has his quirks, but we've both learned to accept Ben who he is right now. And I've asked her once, do you ever think about what it would have been like if he were not diagnosed with this illness, if he could have gotten married and had kids and your kids could have cousins? And she said, what's the point of that, Mom? What's the point of that? That's not the way it is.
Mhm.
So, you know, we're very close, my daughter and I. My son and I are as close as we can be, considering the illness as well. She misses her brother and she misses what could have been. But we always say, you know, it is what it is.
Yeah.
What can we do with what we've got? So I I help her a lot now. She's got 3 kids and I'm there almost every day. So she's getting plenty of my attention, but I can't fix the fact that she lost her brother.
Right.
And she's
Right.
got this new shell of a brother. We still love him. He made a speech at her wedding. Until the breakdown, he was a doting uncle. Tomorrow's another day.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to make sure that everyone who's watching us right now feels like they're seen when it gets really, really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't want to gloss over how bad it got with you, because you've been in some terrible situations. I've read your book, I've read your blog, I've watched you on video, I've watched you make presentations. No one could probably imagine from the way you present that you were tempted to run him over with your car, that you gave him a black eye. I want to make sure that we see all those people out there who might be looking at you and saying, well, yeah, but she doesn't get how bad it can. You get how bad it can get. You totally get it.
Yeah, boy, it's been amazing. And that's what stuck out in the book to you. But I tried to be raw and honest with the book about the thoughts I was having about my child, who at times I hated. And one of the, and I know now I didn't hate him. I hated the illness. I mean, what do you say to a 3-year-old? I don't hate you. I just hate what you did. Like, you know, you make those differentiations. But yeah, it was frustrating. And it made me angry. Why won't he listen to me? Why is he doing this? Why is he lashing out at me? Why is he blaming me? And yeah, there was a time I slapped him. And there was the time he chased me around the block yelling what a terrible mother I am. And there was a time I was trying to detach from a argument we were having and he kept stepping in front of me. So I got in my car to drive away and he went behind the car and I wanted to run him over. I didn't run him over. Wanting to and doing are two different things. But yeah. And listen, he had a breakdown August 29th. It was not pretty. It was not pretty. I have stuck by this man his whole life. And when he went into the hospital, I was heartbroken and relieved. There is self-care is very hard when you have an ill child, especially a mentally ill child. And I don't care if that's PC or not, mentally ill, but he has a mental illness. He has a brain illness. If you have a child with schizophrenia, they are not coming to your door with casseroles or empathy. There's no timetable for recovery, people want to, they just don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. So, and the first time he was in the hospital, everybody rallied to help and people visited him and stuff. But by the seventh time, there's very few like, oh, again, it's hard to have empathy. I get that. It's hard for me to have empathy. The 5.5 months he was hospitalized again was a vacation for me. I mean, I feel for my son. I feel for the loss of his job. And I want to cry when I think about how hard he worked for 9 years to work his way up to being a waiter that was so good that they put him on Yelp all the time. And even when he lost his job, he tried really hard, but the illness wouldn't let him do it. And the illness wouldn't let him stick to his treatment. And I would not let him back in my house when he came out of the hospital. Because for 9 years, I'm remarried. My husband or I, one of us had to stay up until he came home from the restaurant to give him his meds because he wouldn't take them without us for 9 years. So we were up till 2 a.m. One of us, we never went to bed at the same time. We never took a vacation, or at least not for the last 4 or 5 years. We couldn't trust him to take his treatment. And I used to say, okay, one uncomfortable moment in a day and I lose some sleep, but my son gets another 24 hours of life. That was hard. And now that he's in a group home, I'm grateful.
Yeah.
I'm grateful that, because I want to be his mother. I don't want to be his social worker. I don't want to be his psychiatrist. I don't want to be his nurse and give him medication, but I did it for 9 years because it was working. And now I'm letting other people help, but I am stepping in. I'm calling Social Security all the time. I call the psychiatrist to give him, I'm still doing what I can do. But yeah, there are times I hate the illness. It took my son from me. So yeah, I'm not a perfect person and I'm no angel and I'm no saint. So if you have feelings like that, you're normal. It's what you do with the feelings that matter.
People are asking about the various coping mechanisms you had. So I want to go into tough love and then NAMI. And the reason I want to put them in that order is not only because it's chronological, you tried tough love first, but I wonder about the efficacy of something like tough love, where it's an issue of demanding a certain level of discipline for your child. If they don't come through with X, you're not going to baby them. You're not going to enable them. You're going to demand better of them. Ultimately, is there value in that if you're dealing with a mental illness, or is that just the wrong road altogether?
I think boundaries are important. So tough love is something I tried in his teens when I didn't realize he had a brain illness that was preventing him from really understanding when he hit bottom. I look back now and probably he had all kinds of voices in his head or intrusive thoughts, some people prefer to call them, telling him, your mother's crazy. Don't listen to your mother is evil. I don't know what they say to him. All I know is what I hear him say to them, like, oh, she's just my mother. And, this last time he refused to call me mom. He wouldn't call me mom anymore. So, you never know what goes on with the voices. But coping mechanisms. I'm sorry. Is that? I'm so lost now. What is the question?
It's okay. It's okay. I can't tell you how important everything you're saying is. And for everything you say, there are 4 more roads we could go down. I'd like to. So cover what you can cover. We'll be fine.
Yeah, but tell me what the question was.
We were talking about whether tough love ultimately does have value if you're dealing with someone with mental health issues.
Yeah. Tough love. So I just thought, because everybody who had a kid with an addiction said, I let him hit bottom and he came home with a written contract. Well, I thought he had an addiction. So I tried to, and I wouldn't let him in the house, and he lived with other people and he lived on the street for a while, and he'd come back, always would come home, and we'd have a written contract and we'd have a week of a honeymoon, and then it all fell apart. And this happened time and time again. One psychiatrist finally said to me, if your son has schizophrenia and not just addiction, he can hit bottom and he's not going to know it. He's going to say, it's pretty good down here. Think of all the homeless people, many of whom have schizophrenia, that aren't getting it. Oh, if I just do this, it'll be better. So tough love doesn't always work with mental illness because they don't have the logic to connect cause and consequence.
Mhm.
That said, family members have a right to set boundaries, and that's part of self-care, and self-care is very important. For the 9 years my son lived with us, I said, you don't have to believe you have schizophrenia. I'm just telling you, if you want to sleep in your bed, you'll take your meds. If you don't agree to that, then I will change the locks. And I said it with love, but I meant it. And he knew I meant it because he lived homeless in Idaho for 5 months once, but
Mhm.
calling me every Sunday and asking me to pay for a therapist. So that was, you got to see the humor in these things. So I have a right to set boundaries in my home, and any parent of a teenager goes through this too. I have a right. These are the house rules, and you don't have to agree with it, but or you can leave, but said
Mhm.
with love. I never allowed smoking in my home. You have your boundaries, and I kept to my boundaries, and my boundaries now are no, you can't visit because of COVID, but I will bring stuff to you if you like. And if he complains, I'm sorry that that is the way it is. I wish it were different, but this is what I'm willing to do. This is what I am willing to do. This is what I'm not willing to do. What would you like me to do? And then put the ball back in his court. So I wouldn't call it tough love, but I would call it clear and reinforced boundaries. And they're based around a little bit my own needs and my needs of my marriage and the needs of my daughter. And so far, so good.
I want to make a note for those of you who aren't watching chat. Even if you don't have a question, there's a lot of wisdom and questions going on out there. So if you have information to share or you want to just follow what's pretty much a parallel conversation going there too, and a
Really?
lot of links coming up, links to the book, links to your blog, that's all happening on chat. So I recommend that you all drop into chat at some point before we conclude
Any
here.
links to the podcast? Do you guys,
That's they can reach the podcast through your website, right?
right? Because
Okay.
there's two other moms that have recently, and one of them is going to be your next speaker, Mindy Greiling.
Yeah.
And Mindy Greiling and Mimi Feldman and I have a podcast called Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. And we're currently doing that. And it's a podcast. We have 11 episodes. We just finished one about marijuana and schizophrenia. And we're continuing to explore these things. So wherever you get your podcasts, or you can go on YouTube and subscribe to it there. Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. So that's another link if that's helpful. Yeah.
Comment from Jen in the chat. She says, and they are awesome. So there.
Oh, thank you, Jen.
So we left off talking about how you found NAMI and what kind of support you get from them and ultimately your work with them. So tell us that story.
Okay, so NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, does a lot of things. It was started by family members of people with mental illnesses. And politically, there's some controversy there. So I'm going to talk about their education arm, which for me was the lifesaver. And they do a lot of advocacy, which is also wonderful. There is so NAMI is a national organization in Washington, but there's every state, I believe, has an affiliate. And within the state, there are different affiliates within the state. And there's a course called Family to Family, which I took and then taught, and now I train people to do it. And it was a 12-week course, and they've now shortened it to 8. And it's now this year available virtually, and it's free, but we ask a commitment that you come for all 8 weeks if you can. And in those 8 to 12 weeks, you get education. And support groups can be great. In my experience, it depends on who's running the support group and how well they can manage the people who want to monopolize the time. So support groups can be amazing. Just find the right one. Family to Family is an education group, and support happens, but you learn in the 8 weeks, what is a mental illness? What's schizophrenia? What's bipolar? What are the symptoms? What do you look for? How do you handle a crisis? How do you handle a crisis in your area? What part of the brain does it affect? Why won't they take their medication? How can you take care of yourself? How can you advocate for your loved one? A lot of what I learned from good books, and I learned at NAMI, Family to Family. So you can, I'm sure the links are showing up in the chat room, but NAMI.org, and then just look for education and support. They have other things. They have a peer-to-peer support. They have speakers. If any of you are aware of your illness and you're in recovery and you'd like to share your story, you can do that as well on NAMI. So there's a lot that they do that's very, very helpful.
I want to talk about self-care. It can
Okay.
sound like the very Californian self-care, but it does matter. And I want to point out to people that when they hear your resume, you know, she's a speaker, she's a singer, she's a voiceover, she's a radio person. I don't know if some people understand what that looks like when you're working what we in the business call morning drive. Morning drive sounds to people like you're getting on the air at 7 o'clock and improvising, sounding funny, you know, having the news. And it's not. You're getting up at 3 or 3:30.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're preparing a show, you're reading you're doing a lot that people don't see. And at the same time, you were doing that and you had him in the home and you were still trying to work through what's he dealing with, and then how do we medicate? How do I care for him? You're doing theater at night. I looked at that, I thought, you're doing what? And then you have voiceover clients in the middle of the day. And the reason I'm explaining that in such detail is because I want to know, aside from the fact that we all have to have a job, so of course you had a job, all the other things you were doing brought value to your life. And how were you able to keep prioritizing something like theater, which is not going to make you rich, but it feeds your soul? How did you balance all that?
That's such a good question. Nobody has ever asked me that before. So you and I were chatting a bit before, and I checked you out on Wikipedia. We have a lot in common, obviously. And I've always been one of these people who people say, oh, what do you do for work and what do you do for fun? I'm like, well, it's the same thing, because I'm an actor and I love to do theater and I love to do radio and I love to do public speaking. It happens to be what the universe gave me to work with. There's a lot I can't do, but I can do those things. And when I was raising my children, I needed to support them.
Mhm.
And fortunately, although believe me, I've had my other types of jobs in my life, between getting a shift on the radio, teaching drama in my kids' private school, doing theater, which occasionally pays, but not that well. But, you know, that I did for my soul and for my art, to get better at my art. And voiceovers, I was able to support my family. That said, there were summers where I needed to do theater for free, or take an acting class, or, you know, just to feed my soul. And it's hard to be a good parent if you're an unhappy parent.
Mhm.
And so I did those things. Now, morning radio came about just as my son was getting ill. My daughter was in 8th grade, my son was in 10th, and I was doing afternoon drive, which is like 2 to 7, and morning radio came into my lap. And it didn't come into my lap, but I offered to fill in for the morning girl because I was bored with PM Drive. And just so happened, while I was on the air, the executives were in town and they went, we want her instead. So I felt guilty, but I took the job because they said, if you don't take it, we're just going to find someone just like you. So they finagled. So anyway, then you start getting up at 3:30 in the morning. And it's a juggling act. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that keeps changing the frame. And now you have to figure out how to put this piece in here. And I've always been a day-to-day a 1 foot in front of the other. That's how I do it. Just 1 foot in front of the other. I'm going to there's a wonderful song in Frozen 2 where Anna's very depressed and she doesn't know what to do. And she thinks she's lost everything. And she says, I'm just going to do the next right thing.
Mhm.
Next best thing, the next right thing. And that's what I did. I just did the next right thing. So yes, getting up at 3:15 and coming in, and we weren't on the air at 7, we were on the air at 5, but most people were sleeping. So, you know, between 5. So I found a way to work that in. I learned to siesta in the middle of the day. But when my son was getting worse and worse, there were a couple of nights where I thought if I just spoke to him for 3 hours, he would engage me in these 3 hour long conversations in a diner, and I'd have an hour sleep in the car and go to the radio station. Or I was trying to get him hospitalized and I was in the waiting room till 4 a.m. and then I had to go straight to work. Those were tough mornings.
I can
I
imagine.
mean, those were tough mornings, but you put one foot in front of the other and you get through the 5 o'clock hour and you get through the 6 o'clock hour and you just do it. We're all here. We've all gotten through a whole bunch of stuff,
That's true.
you know?
Yes.
Stephen Sondheim, good times and bum times, I've seen them all. And my dear, I'm still here. And this latest crisis, like I never know how I'm going to get through something. I just know I will. And I'll put one foot in front of the other until I do. And there's a fear. Will my son refuse to take his next injection? He might. My mantra is, whatever happens, I'll handle it somehow, or we'll handle it somehow. Can't get anxiety about the future unless it leads to a plan. You can, but if your anxiety can lead to action, great. If it only leads to pointless stress, then it's time to just have faith in yourself and just do the next right thing.
There are so many people in the chat who are asking about meds.
Okay.
And I know that we've already emphasized that you're not a doctor and you really can't take on each individual thought, but in their shoes, where do they go to find the most up-to-date information? Is it NAMI? Are there other places?
Sure. NAMI, you can just find out the most up-to-date information, in pretty much any medical website, the NIMH or Mental Health America. Just Google what are good medications for schizophrenia. The problem is schizophrenia isn't the same for everybody, and people's reactions to medication are different depending on who they are. Some people, we just interviewed somebody on our podcast who's doing really well with risperidone injections. And for my son, it does nothing. I mean, nothing. He may as well be doing nothing. So the only two things he has ever reacted to are Haldol, which is an old antipsychotic and causes possibly permanent side effects. So I'm not a fan. And then the one that is called the last ditch medication, because it can cause agranulocytosis, which can lead to death in 1 out of 100 people. I think that's the percentage, is Clozaril. And you have to have blood work frequently to make sure that your white blood cell count is okay. For that reason, it's often prescribed last. And again, it doesn't work for everybody. For my son, that is the medication that made him able to go back to college and wait on tables. And that is the medication many psychiatrists try everything before they'll try it. If your loved one or you, I don't know if you have the illness or you know someone with the illness or both, if you would prefer an injection that's a time release, there are certain medications that are available in that way. Haldol is one, risperidone is another one. There's Invega is an injection. So not all, Clozaril is not available in that way, and the injections have to be timed just right. Each medication has its side effects, and NAMI has all of this information. And it depends on what works for you. And unfortunately, sometimes they take weeks or months to know if they work. And none of them work 100%. I don't know anybody except one book I read when I was doing my research who said the voices or the intrusive thoughts stopped. Most people say they got quieter and I could handle them. So there's medications out there. If you are a family member, I would remind you that even if your loved one has not signed a release, even if your loved one's treatment team can't give you information because they're over 18, you can still give them information. You can still call and say, I wonder if you would be interested in knowing my son's history. These are the medications he's been on or she's been on. These are the medications they've been on. We'll use the they. This is what has happened in the past. This is what his symptoms are. This is what their symptoms are. So you can always share information with the team If the team discounts your experience and your information, then maybe you need to look for a different team.
Well, in fact, you mentioned, we were talking earlier about your blog, and you said you don't have a lot of confidence right now on the medication that Ben is on now.
Yeah.
How much can you exercise your preference there? He's an adult, he has his own team, but you're experienced and you've watched this and you do have a lot of data, even if you're not a scientist. So how far can you press when you say Ben is not on the right meds?
I can only plant seeds. I plant seeds and I walk away. I can't legally. I've never had the legal right to choose the medication my son is on. Even in the hospital and in Connecticut, where I live, if they're in the hospital on a 72-hour hold and you apply for the right to involuntary commitment and the right to medicate over objection, once that hearing is scheduled, they stay in the hospital. So that's how I couldn't even imagine a 5-month hospital stay, but my son was resisting treatment for that long. And it took a long time to get the hearing, and he wouldn't come to the hearing. And eventually, yes, I got right to medicate, or the hospital in this case got right to medicate over objection. But you never get the right to medicate with a particular medication.
Right.
So Ben went back on the Clozaril at first and then said, no, I don't like it. And then he went off it. And then they said, well, the only other, what worked last time was either you're going to get a shot of Haldol or you can take the Clozaril, and he chose Clozaril because he hates shots, but this time he took the shot. So he is taking a time release form of Haldol, which is more convenient, not going to lie, but I worry about twitching and tardive dyskinesia and the other Parkinsonian type side effects that happen with Haldol. And this has already happened once, the period where the injection starts to wear off before the other one takes over. And that's when even the staff at his home said he's isolating, he's in his room, he's not talking to people. And my son's very social. He loves people. But when the intrusive thoughts get louder, they get more important to him than real people. So yeah, so I don't have rights. So all I did, and he's got a brand new psychiatrist now who I haven't met. And I just wrote a very long letter and said, hope you'll read it. I'm really rooting for you to, maybe suggest to Ben that he did better on the Clozaril. But again, Ben doesn't want to think that the medication should take any credit. He would go off his meds in a minute if he could. So.
A number of people are asking about Ben's future. And again, I want to point to the chat because people are exchanging information here too, as well as asking questions. What are Randye's plans for Ben after you're gone? I'm struggling with that now, Jen says. I'm in the process of applying for co-guardianship with our younger son, who's more than willing to take on that role once I'm gone. I feel so guilty to pass on that level of responsibility to his brother, but I don't want my older son to have a public guardian.
It's a very tough decision. Guilt is part of the package. What I've done is create something called Planned Lifetime Assistance Network. It's in Connecticut. I don't know if there's something similar in your state. And what this does is my portion of the will, half will go to my daughter and half will go to my son's fund. And they are guardians, but much cheaper than a bank guardian. And I have filled out extensive forms as to under what circumstances money should be released for rent, for a birthday cake, it breaks your heart. I told you I'd say that a lot in this interview. But I don't want my daughter burdened with that. In a way, this latest breakdown made it clearer to me because when he was doing well, she and her husband were like, well, we'll build a granny pod in the backyard and he can live there. But what if he goes off his meds? What if he hurts the kids? Like, he's not violent. Don't get me wrong. He's never lifted a finger to anybody, but I don't know what the thoughts will tell him if he's symptomatic.
Right.
I can't put them at risk.
Yeah.
So it's like a Sophie's choice. But I do not want my daughter burdened with that or with the decisions as to what to do with the money. If she wanted to do it, I would let her do it, but I don't want her to have to do it. So for me, I have set up this public guardian, and it's called Planned Lifetime Assistance Network. I don't know if there's anything like that in your state, but that's what we've done for now. And I just have to make sure I update the list of how I want the money spent.
Right. Right.
And I'm trying like heck to get him back on Social Security because he was, in their eyes, fully functional. And now he's not, but hospital records don't count, evidently. And now we need a new psychiatrist report, and the new psychiatrist doesn't know him. And is schizophrenia still a disability? Yes. Even if you're functional, I think it should work like unemployment. If you can work, you don't have to have the Social Security. But if you get another psychotic break and you lose, anyway, that's another fight we're fighting. Spend a
There's
lot
so
of time
many.
on the phone. MRQ, mom who refuses to quit.
I want to ask you, pardon me. I want to ask you about the medical professionals who are watching us right now. We have both consumers of mental health care and we have providers listening to us right now.
Thank you, providers. Thank you, thank you, thank you for choosing this line of work. Just want to say that.
Good. I'm glad. In fact, you were very open about thanking some of the providers you came across.
Mm-hmm.
There were some very touching moments where someone who was in a position of providing care took a moment to let you know you were doing things right. Even at the moment when you were trying to say to Ben, I will not take you into my home under these circumstances, Ben leaves the room and this woman says to you, I need to commend your strength. You just did the right thing as a mom. It's such a simple thing, but it's a thing that gets overlooked a lot by any profession. You don't always remember to take care of people. So in addition to that, what else can the medical profession do to help a mom in your position or a parent in your position?
So I'm so glad you brought up that story. I tried in the book to focus on what providers did right. And there was that moment where I had to declare my son, I had to kick him out of the house and say, he can't return to my house. And that social worker could have fed my guilt, but instead she fed my strength. And she said, I can't tell you how many times I see people come through these doors like a revolving door in their 40s because their mother never kicked them out. So she reinforced my tough decision. Another time, and this just happened recently as well, is if any provider could see my son's strengths, that made my heart soar. When he was in his long hospitalization, when he was 21, one of the nurses, and this is in the book, said, I just want to tell you, your son is the sweetest. He's so polite. Even when he refuses medication, he says, no, thank you, ma'am. I can tell you raised him well. And boy, did I need to hear that when my son had been the one wandering in his bathrobe around the neighborhood, screaming at the top of his lungs in the middle of the night, just to hear a nurse recognize that I was a good parent and that I had raised him well. Even recently, in this most recent hospitalization, one of the nurses said to me, I'm not supposed to say this, but he's my favorite patient. So even those, see the strengths of the person you are treating and of the family who is at their wits' end by the time you meet the family. By the time you meet the family, you may think the mother's a bitch, and you may think the father is crazy, and you may think the siblings are all cruel. Probably not. They're just at the end of their rope.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another social worker who took the time during an intake to say to me, how are you doing? And of course, tissues. And I started crying, and then she said, and how's your daughter doing? More tissues. And I started crying. And then finally I said to her, thank you for asking me. And I said, how do you do this work? I know you're overburdened and there's too many cases. And she sat down on the corner of her desk and she said, I'll tell you why I do this work. It still makes me cry because I like to see people get better. And I do. And she gave me so much hope in that moment. And the problem with schizophrenia is when things get better, they don't necessarily stay better.
Right.
It's a tightrope. But those moments really help. So listen to the families, let them help you with information, see the strengths in the person that has the illness, and build on those.
Our last question, actually, Beth anticipated where we were going. Beth says to the providers, remember, this is a disease that affects the whole family. Educate the entire immediate family. And I hate that we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you about working within the family when someone in your immediate group has mental illness. And we really saw your family and friends run the gamut. Some of them were like right there. And you actually had a relative who said, we're protecting ourselves. We can't be there for him.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about incorporating the family into this ongoing project.
It does run the gamut. And that family member that had to say that to me, we talked about it a lot after the book came out, and I didn't realize that they had recently had a scary experience with someone with schizophrenia. So of course, that's going to be their frame of reference. I would say if you can educate your family, there's so little that's hopeful and helpful with schizophrenia in the media. It's like the last mental illness in the closet because it's different from bipolar. It's a thought disorder, not a mood disorder. And so the only thing you see in the news is violence.
Right.
And, oh, he must have schizophrenia. So naturally people are scared. But those are people struggling with a lot going on in their heads. And if you can find a way to look, everybody has their boundaries and you have to respect your family's boundaries. I wouldn't bring Ben around to see his sister if he's not well. It's scary. I don't need anybody to be scared. But the more they can be educated, and maybe give them a book to read, a blog to read, just to understand in simple terms what's going on. A big moment for me when I knew my son had schizophrenia was I stopped hating him. It wasn't his fault. I thought it was his fault. And then I thought it was my fault. I wasn't parenting him right. It wasn't his fault. He had the bad fortune to get an horrible illness. And once I stopped blaming him, it changed the way I could handle it. And I think if others in the family can understand the illness and what it is and what it isn't, they won't have to be needlessly scared, but they can be realistically cautious if need be and appropriately loving when the time comes.
Beth says our family mantra says, this is the disease, not my son.
Yeah.
So I think this is a great place to conclude it. You're an amazing person. I have to say that there's so many amazing people out there who don't have the opportunity to tell their stories. And I think in a sense, you're talking for all of them too. So I really want to thank you.
My pleasure. And if there's so many good links in the chat, I hope everybody knows you can download that chat by clicking the 3 dots at the bottom. I think you can download everything in the chat onto your own computer, and then those links will be there for you. Am I correct about that?
Yep, the save chat right there when you click on those 3 links. So that should be it. And there's, in fact, this is going to be loaded up to the MHA website as well, so people can see it again and again and again. So
Great.
Randye, thank you.
It's been my pleasure. And if you're watching this after the fact, I'm sure in the links you can see how you can reach my blog or read about my book or get the podcast or send me an email, whatever. If there's a way I can be helpful, let me know. And stay strong, stay hopeful. Researchers, get on it. Providers, thank you.
And with that, we're going to turn it on back to Melissa.
It's not Melissa.
Nope.
Well, no,
Here's
I'm
Melissa.
here. So first, let me thank you so much, Angie and Randye. This is such an important conversation that we're having, and we want to continue this with our 3rd presentation on May 6th. But thank you so much. It's always important to remind people, we're talking about people who have a disease. So thank you for reminding us all of that. I also want to thank Reach and Teach Books for being our official bookseller. If you're interested, they will order the book for you, and their contact information is in the chat. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you on our third event on May 6th. For more information about our organization, please visit our website so you can stay abreast of our current programs and future events. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.